across health, livelihood, and general conditions on the streets.
The purpose of research, friends, under research in the social sciences, is ultimately to understand aspects of the human condition. Um, Conventionally, I think the social sciences have aspired to be objective and scientific, largely using aspects that can be measured, pretty much in using the reference point of objective physical science research, and an attempt to achieve similar standards in the social sciences. And a lot of our understanding, it has enriched our understanding in many ways. Large quantitative statistical studies, the census, for instance, the recent social economic caste census in India, has told us many things. But having said that, there are still many aspects, critical aspects of the human condition, which interest us, and even more so when we look at attempting to understand the situation, the conditions, the constraints, the aspirations of people living with poverty and discrimination. There are many things that in the end, even the best defined, objective, detached, quantitative research methodology cannot accomplish. Understanding of the experience of discrimination itself, social humiliation, isolation, loss, pain, loneliness, hopelessness. So much that is critical in our understanding of other human beings, that somehow fall through the cracks if we're only looking for things that we can objectively measure. There's also been a sense that the only research is only that research is legitimate which is detached. And in a sense, engaged research is seen somehow biased and therefore less legitimate. But once again, I think in both of these assumptions about what is scientific research, I think that the specific understanding that human beings, other human lives, and one's own, they're not inert, objective, external realities that can be studied in the way a chemical or a compound or a physical phenomenon can be studied. These are they're not inert, and they're not objective. They are subjective, and we ultimately need to understand people's realities in ways that they construct their own realities and understand them. And also we need to recognize that when one human being encounters another in this kind of research, this human being who is coming in to research also cannot separate herself or himself entirely from his beliefs, prejudices, biases, convictions, ethics, and some of that is something that I don't even believe should be aspects that we should disengage from when we research the lives of other human beings, particularly vulnerable and disadvantaged human beings. I think that research requires us uh, to be committed to truth, and but not to be uh, not to sort of rid oneself of one's beliefs and convictions and values. I think that those need to be, one needs to be conscious about them, one needs to place them before one. And I think that in the end, uh, subjectivity is hard to eliminate. If I am trying to speak to you and I try to understand and talk to you about how what your life has been, and somebody else sits and talks with you about your life, actually there's a very high probability that quite different stories might emerge, and therefore one also has to recognize that when one is investigating another human being's life, trying to understand it, it is almost like it's not that I come in with my subjectivities and you are a fixed, inert, external object with whom I have to study scientifically in a way that what I study and what another person, what a third person studies, they will come with the same findings. I think that investigating and understanding another person's life is in is a mutual, it's a joint project of a kind, jointly undertaken by two subjective human beings, rather than one human being studying something that is external and fixed. Uh, I think that what I'm trying to say is not in substitution of large-scale quantitative studies. There are aspects of the human condition that require a different kind of engagement, and that engagement uh, cannot and should not be disengaged and detached from an ethical sense of responsibility to the process, and also a consciousness and an awareness of one's own values and participation in that process. Um, I've talked a lot about the values with which one needs to engage in a process uh, of understanding another person's life history. Uh, One has to be, I think, if there's one thing that one really needs to carry as a value, is unconditional respect, not judging, not how do you know what you will do if you are placed in sometimes very difficult situations that another person describes. So I think being respectful, uh, uh, being caring of that other person's feeling, not being extractive. If you're causing a person suffering, that as a result of your questioning, to withdraw from it. So I think that that's one very you have to go in with a sense of respect and responsibility into this process. Um, and also recognize that this person is not, as I said, an external, inert object from which you have to extract your information and move on. There is a sense of the responsibility of one human being to another. That person didn't invite you in, you went in to try to understand this person's life, and you owe it to that person to make that process, if possible, enriching for that person, rather than one that in any way humiliates or indeed makes that person more vulnerable. So the importance of uh, keeping confidences, the importance also of taking a genuinely informed consent to that person. And informed consent often has now been reduced to signing forms without, I'm not talking about that kind of informed consent as much as genuinely explaining to the person who you are, why you're undertaking this research, what this research is going to result in, what you can promise this person and what you cannot. So this is really, I think some of the ethics that you need to carry with you in the study of another person's life history. There are also, I think, skills that you need to develop. In counseling, people talk about the skill of active listening, and I think that's a very similar kind of skill that one needs to develop here. If you go into a course in counseling, they'll tell you there are three kinds of listening. One is passive listening. So, for instance, I'm sort of like, you're talking and I'm sort of sitting like this and sort of looking bored and uninterested. That's one kind. There's another way, which is, almost like, sort of a very aggressive kind of listening where you say something and I interrupt you and I keep sort of butting in and pushing you this way or that. But active listening is where where you're fully there, and through your body language, through your participation, you say, "Oh, really? Did that happen?" And it must have been hard, and and you asking questions, going along with this person, being sensitive, participating. So I think that's a skill you need to develop. You need to also understand. You have to also go in with a certain degree of prior cultural understanding, and cultural misunderstandings across cultures, but across classes, are not at all uncommon. And in India, those of us who belong to the middle class, in many ways, are culturally very, very separated from people of another social class. So, for instance, how you talk to an older person, for instance, and there are global examples of this as well. I was reading somewhere somebody conducting research in Latin America, for instance. Or Africa. So there culturally you don't, if you're talking to an older person, you're supposed to not look at that person in the face. You're supposed to keep your face down. But in a Western context, you might sort of say that guy is a very shifty-eyed kind of fellow. He can't even sort of look me in the eye and speak. So there can be a great cultural misunderstanding, for instance. So you need to understand how you speak to people. A young man brought up in an Islamic culture, again, may have been taught that it's not respectful to speak to a woman looking at her in her face. And again, this can result in misunderstanding as well. So I think that, and it's good to speak respectfully, learn how you would speak to an older person, for instance. How would you speak to a person of a different gender? How would you speak to a younger person? And so that you make the discussion enriching for both. And I think that another skill that it is important to develop is the skill of what I would call listening to people's silences in a sense, not just their words. We, you know, we are interested. Sometimes, if a person does not want to speak about something, that is significant in itself and also should be respected. Uh, how a person, if a person responds with a sigh or with with some kind of expression of sadness, uh, or with anger or with joy, as they talk about something, that's also significant. Um, and to give you couple of examples, and I think that you really need to understand that the purpose of a life history is not simply to get a chronology of the events of a person's life. That's just like the skeleton of your life history. Uh, the flesh and blood and soul of it is how this person has engaged with those events. So it is really about how, not just the facts of that person's life, but how that person, what that what that means to that person. So for instance, I have a book of life histories called Unheard Voices. So I'll give you a few examples from them to illustrate what I'm saying. So I was talking, for instance, to this sex worker in Hyderabad, and she was educated up to class 12. She went into the profession voluntarily, and she talked to me a lot about her life. And but I found that she had there were periods when she would spend within brothels, and there'd be periods where she did other things with her life. And she would not want to talk to me about what actually transpired within the brothels. And I respected that. And I found she didn't want to talk about it, and I just let that pass. But I also found it interesting that she used a very specific word. She used to describe the periods of her life when she was in working in brothels and doing sex work as periods of her field work. Now, field work has a very specific connotation, about working in, it has a bit of a halo in social work and research about going out and working with people in need in difficult circumstances. And since she was an educated young woman, I found the use of that word interesting. And I also recorded it in my story. And I said, I don't know, but I speculated whether she actually looked at her way, the period of her life when she did sex work in the way we would look at field work. So alert to how people talk about their lives and what kind of expression. I tell another story of a woman who's in manual scavenging, this caste-based profession where people have to actually clean people's excreta with their own hands. It's the most humiliating profession, and so I have the story of Naranamma and how she engaged with it. And I also talk about the initial period when people went to her and said, "You do this work. We'd like to talk to you." And she got very angry, and she denied that she ever did this kind of work. So even in the fact of her denial, which was in a strictly literal sense a falsehood, she was telling a profound truth about how she felt humiliated by that experience. Or, for instance, I noticed in the time that I spent with her, I went with her during her work, how spotlessly clean her house was, much cleaner than I've seen most people's houses, everything sparkling. Her dress, her hair. And it was on the same head that she would have to carry a basket with excreta pouring down. And, in a sense, her extreme cleanliness was something that I saw almost like her resistance and her rebellion daily against what society has classified her to be as to be unclean. So things like this. I mean, I saw a story. It's not just what a person says, but how a person says it, and a lot of this. And sometimes, there are very beautiful ways of articulation. Again, in this book, I'm talking to this person who's been displaced by a large development project, and a huge reservoir has sort of flooded the entire area. And he says that, when I'm on a boat now, and I'm, in the middle of this reservoir, and I reach a point where I know that just below me, under the water, is where my village lay. That's when he said, my हिंदी में कहते हैं कि सीना फटता है. My heart, my chest rips apart. So this is something that, it is being alert to what people have experienced, but how they describe and how they engage. This is really what we're trying to do in our life histories. And in the end, perhaps both in terms of the values that you need to carry with you, but also in terms of the skills you need to develop, I would really talk about ultimately the quality of empathy. And empathy, to my mind, is both an act of, it's first an act of imagination, and then it's an act of feeling. And somewhere this the whole exercise of writing life histories is an exercise in empathy. And if you do it well, you would understand, both the imagination and that shared solidarity of feeling would make you a better researcher, a better human being, in some very fundamental ways. And I hope it would also be of value, equally, in terms of affirming the dignity, the equal dignity of the person who's the subject of your research.